That night, the tribal chief cracked, not as part of a storyline but in raw reality. The Bloodline stood in shock. They saw something no one else was ready for. It was supposed to be a standard segment, a contract signing, the kind of thing you can do in your sleep after a decade in the business. Roman Reigns, flanked by the Bloodline, was set to face off against Drew McIntyre and Randy Orton ahead of a pay-per-view. The energy in the arena was electric, exactly as planned. But backstage, something was off. It wasn't a tangible thing, nothing you could point to on a production sheet. It was in the air. Roman was quieter than usual, his movements more deliberate, almost heavy. The swagger was there. The championship draped over his shoulder was real, but the usual spark in his eyes was muted. He wasn't just playing the role of a man with the weight of a dynasty on his back. He was living it. Every week, the pressure mounted, not just to perform, but to be the tribal chief, this untouchable, mythological figure. He had carried the company, battled back from illness, and built an empire of narrative. But empires are heavy. That night, you could feel the stones of it pressing down on him. Paul Heyman watched him, a slight, almost imperceptible furrow in his brow. He knew Roman better than anyone. He sensed the stillness, the deep internal coiling of a spring that had been wound too tight for too long. The audience, however, saw only the icon walking to the ring. They saw the conqueror, not the man underneath who was slowly running out of air. The ring felt different as he stepped through the ropes. The heat of the lights, the roar of thousands. It was all familiar, but it didn't energize him the way it normally did. It felt like noise. He stood in the center of the ring, the microphone in his hand feeling less like a weapon and more like a burden. Jimmy, Jay, and Solo Sikoa took their positions around him, their faces stoic, a living wall of familial strength. But tonight, that wall seemed to be boxing him in. He could feel their presence, their expectations, their silent promise to follow his lead. What happens when the leader doesn't know where he's going? He looked out at the sea of faces, a blur of signs and colors. They weren't cheering for Joe Anoa'i. They were cheering for a character he had perfected, an invincible, calculating, dominant force of nature. They chanted his name, Roman, Roman, Roman. And with each repetition, the distance between the man and the myth grew wider. He was an actor in the most demanding play of his life, with no intermission in sight. The camera zoomed in for the close-up, and he delivered his signature line, "Acknowledge me." The words came out perfectly. The cadence was right, but for the first time it sounded less like a command and more like a plea. A plea to see past the persona, to understand the sacrifice. No one noticed. The show went on. Drew McIntyre and Randy Orton made their entrance. Their music hit, and the crowd's energy shifted. They were the heroes of this chapter in the story, meant to challenge the unshakable king. Drew was intense, his eyes burning with a focused fire. Randy was the opposite, cool, calculating, a predator coiled and ready. They entered the ring, and the verbal sparring began, hitting all the scripted beats. Drew spoke of legacy, of taking back the championship for the fans. Randy, ever the Viper, spoke with a quiet venom, dissecting Roman's reliance on his family. It was all going according to plan. The tension was building beautifully. The fans were hooked. But then Randy went slightly off script. It was a subtle jab, almost a throwaway line, but it was personal. He mentioned Roman's journey, his battles outside the ring, and then added, "The thing is, Roman, everyone loves a comeback story, but they're getting tired of this one. Maybe it's time for the story to end." The line hung in the air, sharper than intended. It wasn't an insult to the character. It felt like a critique of the man. You could feel the oxygen leave the ring. Backstage, the producers exchanged a quick, nervous glance. It was a good line, a great line for a heel like Orton, but it landed wrong. It was too close to the bone, too near the truth of the exhaustion that was etched on Roman's face under the bright lights. Roman didn't flinch. He didn't move a muscle. For a full 5 seconds, he just stared at Orton. The crowd, sensing a shift, grew quiet. The usual buzz of a hot segment was replaced by a low, uncertain hum. This wasn't in the script. The silence was deafening. In the production truck, the director was yelling into the headset. "What's he doing? Get a shot of the Usos. Get Heyman." But everyone was frozen. The Bloodline looked at Roman, their expressions shifting from intimidation to genuine confusion. Jimmy Uso took a half-step forward, a silent question on his face. Paul Heyman's eyes widened, the mask of the wise man slipping to reveal a man in a panic. He knew that look on Roman's face. It wasn't the tribal chief staring down an opponent. It was Joe, staring at a man who had just unknowingly touched the rawest nerve. The camera stayed tight on Roman's face. His jaw was clenched, but it was his eyes that told the story. The cold, calculating gaze of the tribal chief was gone. In its place was something else, something wounded, something exhausted, something dangerously real. When he finally brought the microphone to his lips, the first word he spoke wasn't a threat. It was a quiet, almost whispered, "What did you say?" It wasn't for the crowd. It was for Randy. Randy Orton, a 20-year veteran, knew immediately he had crossed a line. He tried to recover, to pull it back into the realm of storyline. He started to reply with a rehearsed heel taunt, but Roman cut him off. "No, say it again." The tone was flat, devoid of character, of performance. It was the voice of a man, not a gimmick. The 15,000 people in the arena fell completely silent. You could hear the hum of the lighting rigs. Drew McIntyre, standing beside Orton, looked utterly lost. He glanced from Roman to Randy, his face a canvas of confusion. This was no longer a wrestling promo. This was a confrontation. Roman took a step forward, his movements slow, deliberate. "You want to talk about my story?" he said, his voice dangerously low. "You have no idea what it took to write it. The chapters you never saw, the pages that were written in hospital rooms, in quiet moments of doubt." His voice began to tremble, not with manufactured rage, but with a raw, unfiltered emotion that had no place in a WWE ring. Paul Heyman was now visibly distressed, whispering Roman's name, trying to break the spell. But Roman was somewhere else entirely. He was no longer on SmackDown. He was reliving every struggle, every fear, every sacrifice that brought him to this point. He was a man unburdening himself in the most public form imaginable. The Bloodline was paralyzed. For years, their dynamic was clear. Roman commanded, and they obeyed. They were the enforcers of his will, the soldiers of his empire. But now, their leader was crumbling before their eyes, and they had no orders to follow. Solo Sikoa, the stoic enforcer, looked at his brother with a flicker of fear. This wasn't the chief he knew. Jimmy and Jay exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated panic. They weren't performers anymore. They were brothers watching their cousin, their leader, come undone. They wanted to step in, to protect him, but they were frozen by the sheer vulnerability of the moment. Roman's gaze never left Orton. "This title," he said, his voice cracking as he lifted the championship belt slightly, "isn't a prop. It's proof. It's proof that you can walk through hell and still stand at the head of the table. You talk about ending the story. You have no idea how many times it almost ended for me." A single tear traced a path down his cheek, and the camera caught it. In the truck, the director made a decision. He didn't cut away. He held the shot. He knew, with a sinking feeling in his stomach, that this was no longer entertainment. This was a confession, and millions of people were watching a man's soul being laid bare under the guise of a wrestling show. The moment the tear fell, the atmosphere in the arena fundamentally changed. It was no longer a chorus of boos and cheers. It was a collective, held breath. The fans were utterly bewildered. Was this part of the show? Was it the most brilliant piece of method acting they had ever seen? Or was it real? The uncertainty created a strange, profound silence. The signs in the crowd stopped waving. The chants died in people's throats. They were watching something intensely private, and the instinct of the crowd was not to cheer or boo, but to simply bear witness. Orton and McIntyre were professionals, but they had no playbook for this. Orton's Viper persona evaporated, replaced by the concerned face of a colleague. He lowered his microphone, a silent admission that the game was over. Drew, a man known for his fire and passion, looked down at the mat, almost out of respect, as if not wanting to intrude on a moment of profound grief. He was no longer Roman's rival. He was just a man, standing a few feet away from another man who was clearly in a world of pain. In that moment, there were no heels or baby faces. There were no champions or challengers. There were just people in a ring, caught in a moment of raw, unplanned, and terrifying human emotion, with the whole world watching. Backstage, the usual controlled chaos of a live broadcast had descended into organized panic. Producers were speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Writers were staring at their scripts, now completely useless. Other wrestlers who were watching on the monitors in the gorilla position were silent. The usual banter and jokes had ceased. They all knew the grind. They all knew the pressure, the toll it took on your body, your mind, your family. They were watching one of their own, one of the strongest pillars of their industry, show the cracks they all tried so hard to hide. A veteran producer finally made the call. Cut his mic, go to commercial, now. But it was too late. Roman, seemingly hearing the shift in energy or simply reaching his breaking point, let the microphone fall from his hand. It hit the mat with a dull, echoing thud that sounded like a gunshot in the silent arena. He turned, not looking at his family or his opponents, and slowly, deliberately, walked out of the ring. He didn't walk up the ramp. He simply exited, disappearing into the darkness of the ringside area, leaving his championship, his family, and 15,000 stunned people behind him in a state of utter disbelief. The show cut abruptly to a commercial, but the story was far from over. The commercial break ended, and the commentators, their voices hushed and uncertain, tried to steer the ship back on course. They called it an intense and unprecedented moment but offered no explanation. They couldn't. The rest of the show felt hollow, a ghost of what it was supposed to be. The main event happened, a winner was declared, but no one was paying attention. The only thing anyone could talk about was Roman. Back in the locker room, the air was thick with a heavy silence. The Usos and Solo Sikoa eventually found him sitting on a crate in a dark corner, his head in his hands. The tribal chief was gone. In his place was just Joe. They didn't speak. For the first time, they didn't look to him for guidance. Jay simply sat down beside him, putting a hand on his brother's back. It wasn't a gesture of a soldier to his chief. It was the gesture of a brother, a quiet acknowledgement of a pain that words couldn't touch. Paul Heyman stood in the doorway, his face ashen. He had managed legends, navigated chaos, and spun narratives for decades. But he had no script for this. He just watched the family he had helped build, now bound not by power, but by a shared, silent understanding of a burden that had become too much to bear. The story of what happened that night on SmackDown became a legend, whispered about in fan forums and locker rooms for years to come. The company never acknowledged it as anything other than a moment of intense passion. But everyone who was there, everyone who watched it live, knew they saw something more. They saw the veil between the performer and the person tear open. They saw the immense, crushing weight of maintaining a persona of invincibility in a world that demands it, both in and out of the ring. Roman Reigns would eventually return. The tribal chief persona rebuilt, stronger and more dominant than ever. But something had changed. The audience looked at him differently now. They still acknowledged their chief, but they did so with a newfound understanding of the man who wore the crown. They had seen the cracks in the armor, and it made him more compelling, more real than any championship belt ever could. It was a reminder that the giants we create in these arenas are still mortals, walking a tightrope between myth and reality. It was a reminder that even legends are human and sometimes The mask cracks.